Hey everyone, welcome back to another Vivarium build. Without any delay, let's get right into making the new 180 gallon Vivarium. As I typically do, we'll start out this build with the false bottom. If you recall, this enclosure previously housed my king snake Houdini, so I already had an egg crate false bottom made. However, I needed to make some modifications so that this false bottom would be suitable for the new Vivarium. That said, I removed the planters and filled in the holes with more egg crate attached with zip ties. You'll notice that the egg crate is already covered in a layer of carbon fiberglass window screen mesh. As many of you know, this is my preferred barrier in most cases. Originally, I used this barrier to keep mulch from falling down into the main false bottom area, so I used a relatively coarse mesh because it was cheaper at the time. That being said, this mesh is just too coarse for the substrate that we will use in just a moment. So I covered the egg crate in an additional layer, but this time with weed control fabric. This isn't the same thing as weed blocker, which I've advised in the past is not the best solution. Unlike weed blocker, this allows water to readily pass through it while also retaining the substrate. You might be wondering why I used this instead of a finer mesh. Well, I wanted to try something new, and I believe this could be a better option than mesh moving forward. Anyways, I cut out a piece of the barrier and covered the existing mesh. Then I zip tied along the top corner, leaving some excess on the sides. With the false bottom completed, it was then placed into the enclosure. From there, I proceeded to put the cocoa husk liner backgrounds into their respective locations. If you recall, these are the same backgrounds from the previous build. They are essentially just a sheet of insulation foam with a few protrusions of expanding foam covered in cocoa husk liner. These could work as a decent background in their current state, but they don't have enough definition for my liking. So I got a really large piece of cork bark and propped it up in a good location using some bags of substrate. With the cork bark in place, a few additional elements were incorporated, including planters and accent cork bark pieces. To attach the planters, I simply wedged them in place or stuck them onto the background with a thumbtack. The cork accents, on the other hand, were stuck onto the background with a nail. Next, I got some great stuff pond foam and applied it to the background. My goal here was to add a lot of definition to the background and create a canopy area of sorts using the cork bark. This will become even more apparent as we progress through the build. After applying all of the pond foam, I let it cure for around 8 hours or so. Then I removed the bags of substrate, thumbtacks, and nails and carved out the foam with a razor scraper. Doing this step correctly is pretty important. By carving out the foam, you not only get a better aesthetic, but you also expose the spongy interior of the foam itself. Whenever we add the silicone in just a moment, it will more readily stick to the spongy surface than the glossy, smooth surface of the newly cured foam. With the foam completely carved out, we'll move on to the next step, which is applying the 100% silicone. To do so, I like to caulk a generous amount of silicone in globs and then disperse it with a paintbrush. I find that this is easier and makes less mess. Next, I got a few handfuls of bark and threw them at the silicone. Normally, you could get away with simply dropping it in place, but since I'm building this vivarium in the upright position, I don't have much of a choice otherwise. The same thing was also done with some cocoa fiber. However, as I added the cocoa fiber, I pressed it into the silicone with my hands. This is really important for the longevity of your background, because otherwise the cocoa fiber is prone to fall out of the silicone over time. These same procedures were then repeated for the entire background. I should also mention that you could use cocoa fiber alone for this process, but using bark creates more texture and a better climbing surface for arboreal animals such as geckos. After the main part of the background was complete, it was time to add some additional hardscape elements, in this case manzanita wood. Using a board, I propped up the branch on the background. I also snipped off a few branches to create a better aesthetic. Then I repeated the same process for another branch on the right side. With these branches secured, some accent branches were then stuck directly into the foam. This works really well for small branches, but I don't recommend it for larger elements. Next, I got a can of Great Stuff Gaps and Cracks expanding foam and applied it over top of the manzanita wood. I ran out of pond foam and didn't want to buy more, so I used this foam instead. It works just as well, but unless you use black silicone, you may end up seeing the yellow foam through the silicone and cocoa fiber layer. Anyways, after the foam cured for a good 8 hours or so, I removed the support boards and carved it out like before using a razor scraper. After getting it all carved out, I covered the foam in silicone, bark, and cocoa fiber just like before. Now we'll make some jungle vines. You may have seen one in the previous clips and wondered what it was. Hobbyists have been making DIY jungle vines for years using various methods. I wanted to keep it simple using materials that I already had. So I got 3 different thicknesses of cotton rope. On that, if you're going to take the time and money to make jungle vines, be sure to get different thicknesses. Doing so will allow you to create a much more natural look, which is probably why you're making the vines in the first place. Anyways, creating the vines is quite simple. All that you have to do is get a length of rope, coat it in silicone, and then knead it into some cocoa fiber. With a thicker rope like this, it's a little more challenging because you can't do the entire rope in one go. Even the next thickness down is much easier because you can roll the rope into a ball to apply the silicone. Either way, just make sure you do your best to squeeze the cocoa fiber onto the rope. After you're done making the vines, be sure to let them sit out for at least 24 hours so that the silicone can cure. With the vines cured and ready to go, let's put them into the vivarium. In doing so, I wanted to twine as many together as possible, much like you'd see in nature. I also wanted the vines to look like they had competed against a tree and won the battle. What I mean is that in nature, vines are competitive. They will climb up and over trees and oftentimes kill them. Since the branches are from a dead tree, this will help create the aesthetic that I'm going for. You'll notice that I'm using super glue to attach these vines together and onto various surfaces. Before you get all up in arms about it, cyanoacrylate superglue is totally safe to use for applications like this if you allow for the proper dry time. In fact, it's often used in aquarium applications. I really wanted these vines to look like they were stuck to everything, and superglue allowed me to pull that off quite well. Now it's finally time to mix up the substrate. I do this all by sight and feel because I've mixed it up so many times, but if you want to get more information on it, be sure to follow the link. To start, I'm using about 1 part of cocoa fiber. Then I added roughly 2 parts of sphagnum moss. Next I added 1 part of bark and roughly 1/2 part of lumpwood charcoal. Finally, I topped it off with the substrate from my 8-year-old vivarium. I did this because that substrate is extremely well established. Although I did have to add additional substrate to that vivarium over the years, the oldest portion of it is around 8 years old. There are also old roots, leaves, and other organic components that will serve as a quick food source for our microfauna. All things considered, a good substrate will serve as the foundation to your vivarium. If you want your plants to grow well and your microfauna to thrive, the substrate comes first. Now let's put the initial layer of substrate into the vivarium. There's about 20 gallons of substrate here, and in the end, I used all 20 gallons. That said, I like to add it as I go rather than all at once. As I've explained in previous videos, I also recommend sloping the substrate up toward the back of the vivarium, meaning that it's much thinner in the foreground than it is in the background. This will create a greater sense of depth, and allow you to provide an adequate amount of substrate for those large background plants. From there, it was time to pin the ficus pumila onto the background. At first glance, this might seem like a total waste of time because the majority of ficus leaves died off later on. That's not a big deal though, because the stems and roots are still completely intact. Although I think ficus pumila is an easy plant, and it's portrayed that way by others, it can be quite temperamental. In short, this plant hates change. Whether that be a change in temperature, a change in humidity, or something else, there will be some amount of acclimation die-off guaranteed. The severity of this, of course, is dictated by the amount of change. So for those of you who have commented about having issues with this plant, give it time. Just because the leaves died off doesn't mean that the plant is dead. Once it becomes accustomed to its new environment, it will come back stronger and more dense than ever. The main thing that you want to avoid is having the stems dry out or melt back. In this instance, I had issues keeping the heat at the correct level. I accidentally left Houdini's heat lamp in the light compartment, and it was getting upwards of 86 degrees Fahrenheit, which is just way too hot and much different than what the plants were used to. So a lot of the plants, and the ficus included, were actually melting back because they were literally being cooked by the light. It took me a day to realize what was going on, and once I removed the light, everything has been good since. Also, I'm keeping the humidity in this setup between 95 and 99%, which is much higher than it was before. Anyways, most of the plants that experienced acclimation issues have since bounced back and are showing off some new growth. That being said, it's a real shame that the ficus didn't stay as it was, but as time progresses it will quickly grow to look as it did before. After I got the ficus in place, I then gave the vivarium a decent spray down to start getting the humidity up to speed. Next we can plant and set up the rest of the vivarium. Rather than run off all the plants' names as I typically would, I'll put their names up at the end of the video, so stay tuned for that if you're curious. You may have wondered why I didn't put much on the left side of the setup. Well, I wanted to give ample room for my larger plants to grow, and this was the perfect spot. So I began putting the majority of my background plants in the left corner. During this part, and the entire build for that matter, I like to move the plants around until I get the placement just right, so you'll see me doing a lot of that throughout the build. As I've said many times before, when choosing your plants, be sure to choose a good variety. More specifically, plants that have different looking and different sized leaves. This will help you achieve textural contrast, which in turn will allow you to make a natural aesthetic quite easily. Of course, the placement of the plants is very important as well when trying to pull this off. That said, obviously you want to keep most of your larger plants in the background and the smaller ones in the foreground. However, I do recommend placing some tall plants in the foreground and vice versa. This will break up the landscape and in fact is a natural aesthetic. In nature, plants don't distribute themselves neatly by height as you often see in people's setups. In line with that, I try to place the plants in a way that keeps you interested. Each plant acts as a focal point that draws your eye throughout the setup. Essentially, you want to create visual tension. There are countless ways to make tension in your composition, but in this instance, I'm mostly using the variation of plants to do so. Regardless, there is tension in nature, and that's exactly what I try to do when creating my naturalistic landscapes. Enough on that though, I just wanted to give you additional insight on how I set up my enclosures. You'll notice that I periodically spray the plants throughout the build. This is really important when building a large vivarium like this because there's relatively no humidity yet. Doing so will keep your plants hydrated and help you get a jump start on the humidity. Since I have the majority of the vivarium hardscaped with a background, I mainly need to add accent hardscape elements. So throughout the build, various twigs and other natural elements were placed among the plants. If you have the chance to, I recommend creating levels in the substrate with your hardscape elements. For example, I'm using this piece of cork bark to make the substrate higher in the background than it is in the foreground. Using the cork makes it look a little more interesting than simply sloping the substrate as I described earlier. At a certain point, I decided that it was time to start placing the leaf litter. I don't really like the look of leaf litter unless it's placed in a way that looks natural. That said, I like to place it as I'm planting the enclosure so that I can make it look like the plants are growing up from underneath it. However, you'll notice that I planted a lot of carpeting plants. Long term, I want them to cover up a greater portion of the leaf litter. For the last bit of planting, I'm adding some bromeliads and air plants. Do you remember that superglue from earlier? Well, supergluing these types of plants in desirable locations works really well. The superglue won't damage the plants at all, and it will allow you to anchor the plants before they do so naturally with their roots. Lastly, I added some of the microfauna, including springtails and dwarf purple isopods. I'm just starting out with these ones for now, but as we move forward, I'll add various other species. We covered a lot of ground in this video, but the vivarium is far from complete. A lot of the plants really have to grow in, and many of them also have to bounce back from the issues I had in the beginning. Unfortunately, some of the plants died off completely, so they will need to be replaced as well. I also want to add a lot more plants, including more bromeliads and air plants, to name a few. There's quite a bit that I still have to do on my end before I even want to think about stocking this. I will do a follow-up video in about a month or so, and we can discuss more about stocking at that time. However, I did drop various hints throughout the video as to what I'm going to keep in this, so hopefully you were paying attention. Finally, I'll leave you with a few takeaways. Understand that you're not going to have 100% success. It could be something as simple as acclimation die-off from your plants, or a few plants just don't work at all. Don't get discouraged though, be patient with it. 9 out of 10 times the plants will actually come back given enough time, assuming that they were actually suitable for the vivarium to begin with. I've had plants show up years later after I thought they were long gone, so it definitely does happen. Also, as you're setting up your vivarium, take your time. I built this one over about a 2-week span of time, and I'm still not complete. I want to make the thing as perfect as possible so that way I can enjoy it for a really long time. In the past, I used to jump into builds and really just rush through them. The previous 125 gallon vivarium actually was a product of rush. It was not set up optimally at all, but even still it was going strong 8 years later. I didn't know nearly as much back then as I do now, so you definitely don't need to be an expert when trying to set up a vivarium. Experiment and have fun with it. Finally, don't overthink your setup, let it take shape on its own. Move the plants around for hours until you love what you've made. On that, I hope that you all find joy in making your masterpiece and were able to gain some insight from this video. Be sure to subscribe if you want to see the future of this vivarium and more builds like it. I thank you for watching, and if you wouldn't mind giving this video a thumbs up, I'd greatly appreciate it. Anyways, I'll see you in the next one, and peace.